All right, so let's dive right into this whole AI thing. It seems like every day there's a new headline, robots taking over the world or some amazing new breakthrough. It's a lot to keep up with.
It really is. And honestly, it's easy to get caught up in all the hype without really grasping what it actually means for us, day to day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what we're here to do today, right?
Hmm.
We've got some really interesting reports here about AI stuff that's actually happening right now in the real world, and we're going to break it all down.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're talking about things like companies using AI to diagnose diseases, like from MRI scans, and how these big tech companies are trying to figure out ethical guidelines for this whole AI explosion.
It's interesting though, right? Because we're at this point where AI isn't just some sci-fi concept anymore. It's like it's having a real impact on our lives, from healthcare to even tackling things like climate change.
And speaking of healthcare, this media AI story really caught my eye. They're saying their AI can actually diagnose diseases from MRI scans, sometimes even better than human doctors can. Is that even possible? It sounds kind of wild.
It's definitely a bold claim, but the technology behind it is really interesting. They're using a process called deep learning where they basically train the AI on this massive amount of data. In this case, it's like tons and tons of MRI images.
So, like, they're showing the AI thousands, maybe even millions of MRIs
Yeah.
and teaching it to recognize patterns.
Exactly. And by doing that, the AI learns to spot these tiny details, these anomalies that even a really experienced doctor might miss. Like imagine something like cancer, where catching it early is so important. This AI could theoretically spot a tiny tumor that a radiologist might overlook early on.
See, that's what I mean. It's like, on the one hand, that's incredible. They could actually save lives. But on the other hand, it's kind of unnerving to think that an AI could potentially outperform a trained human doctor.
I get that it's definitely a strange thing to wrap your head around.
It makes you wonder, though, how do you even begin to integrate that kind of technology into our current healthcare system? Wouldn't it be insanely complicated?
Oh, absolutely. It's not as simple as just plugging in the AI and letting it take over. There are a lot of challenges when it comes to integrating this kind of technology into a system as complex as healthcare.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for one, you have to think about the human element. Doctors and nurses would need to be trained to work alongside this AI to understand what it can and can't do. There's a whole level of trust that needs to be built.
And what about the patients themselves? Imagine getting a diagnosis from an AI instead of a human doctor that feels very impersonal.
Absolutely. There's a huge psychological aspect to consider. Patients need to be comfortable with the idea of this technology potentially making life-altering decisions about their health.
It really makes you think, on one hand, we have the potential to save lives with these early diagnoses, but on the other, it's like we're talking about this massive undertaking of merging AI with this system that's already so complex and human-centered.
And honestly, that's just one part of it, right? There's also this huge issue of validation, like making sure that this AI is accurate and reliable for everyone. You can't have an AI that only works for certain groups of people.
Oh, absolutely right. That would just make existing healthcare disparities even worse.
Exactly. And then you have to think about the ethical and legal implications was what if the AI makes a mistake? Who's responsible then? And how do we make sure patient data is protected in this whole new landscape? There are so many questions that need to be addressed.
Yeah, it feels like we're on the verge of this healthcare revolution, but we're also kind of stepping into the unknown,
Yeah.
which is both exciting and a little scary.
It is, but speaking of navigating uncharted territory, that leads us to our next topic, which is all about the ethics of AI development and
Mhm.
how some of these big tech companies are trying to get ahead of these concerns.
Right, because we've all heard those concerns about AI bias, like those facial recognition systems that are less accurate for people of color or algorithms used in hiring that just perpetuate existing biases.
Exactly. Those are very real concerns, and thankfully there's a growing awareness of how crucial it is to address them. We actually have some info here about how a bunch of major tech companies are teaming up to create a global ethical AI framework, which is a pretty big
A
deal.
global ethical AI framework that sounds incredibly ambitious. What does that even mean? Break it down for me.
So basically, it's an attempt to come up with like a set of guidelines and principles for developing and using AI responsibly. And at its core, this framework is all about three main things: privacy bias, mitigation, and transparency.
Okay, so let's start with privacy. In this day and age of data breaches and everyone being concerned about their online privacy, that one seems Huge.
Absolutely. And with AI, those privacy concerns are even bigger because these systems are often trained using these massive data sets of personal information. So this framework really emphasizes things like strong data encryption, clear consent mechanisms, and being transparent about how that data is actually used to train AI systems.
It's about giving people more control over their own data and how it's being used.
Exactly. It's about making sure that people's data isn't being used to train these AI systems without them knowing or agreeing to it. And it's about holding companies accountable for how they handle that information.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about bias mitigation? How can you teach an AI to not be biased when it's learning from data that might be inherently biased in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
It's a huge challenge, but this framework tries to tackle it in a few ways. First, it stresses how important it is to use diverse data sets to train these AI systems. That means making sure the data reflects a wider range of perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences.
So not just feeding the AI a bunch of data that's just going to reinforce existing biases.
Exactly. It's about actively looking for and using data that represents the real world in all its diversity, and it goes beyond just the data itself. The framework also talks about the need for diverse voices in the development process. If you have a bunch of engineers designing these systems who all come from similar backgrounds and have the same worldview, it's more likely that the AI they create will reflect those limited perspectives.
So diversity in both the data and the people creating the AI.
Exactly. It's about bringing a lot of different perspectives to the table to reduce the risk of creating AI that either perpetuates existing biases or even creates new ones.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've talked about privacy and bias mitigation. What about transparency? What does that look like when it comes to AI?
Transparency is all about making AI's decision-making processes clearer so people can understand and scrutinize them.
So instead of the AI being this mysterious black box that spits out decisions, we can actually understand why it made a certain choice.
Exactly. It's about being able to trace back the AI's thought process to figure out what factors led to a particular outcome. And this is super important in things like healthcare finance and criminal justice, where AI is being used more and more to make really important decisions.
Oh, for sure. Transparency in those areas seems absolutely crucial.
Mm.
You don't want to be denied a loan or, even worse, be wrongly accused of a crime because of some biased algorithm that no one can explain.
Exactly. And on a broader level, transparency also helps build trust. If people understand how AI works and can see that it's being developed responsibly, they're more likely to be open to it and all the potential benefits it offers.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to build trust in the very idea of AI.
Yeah.
Right? Showing people it's not some scary thing operating in secret, but something that's accountable and explainable,
Yeah.
something that's built with ethics in mind, which honestly, after that deep dive into healthcare, is kind of reassuring to hear.
I agree. It is encouraging to see these tech giants actually taking these steps. This framework could really set a new standard for the entire industry, which is huge, especially as AI gets more and more powerful.
It's like they're trying to write the rule book before things go totally off the rails. But even with these guidelines in place, it still feels like there's this big question mark hanging over how AI is going to change the world. And I don't mean like robots taking over, but in a more fundamental way.
I think that's a really important point. And that leads us to this other interesting application of AI that we haven't even touched on yet, which is its potential role in fighting climate change.
Wait, AI fighting climate change? How does that even work?
It might sound strange, but it's a growing field. There's this company, Green Compute, that's actually using AI to analyze the carbon footprint of other businesses.
So instead of companies just guessing or making rough estimates about their environmental impact, they can get a much more accurate assessment using AI.
Exactly. And it's not just about giving them a number. This AI platform looks at data from every part of the business, their energy use, supply chains, transportation, even employee commutes, and it gives them specific recommendations on how to reduce their impact.
It's like having a sustainability expert on call 247.
That's a great way to put it, and the impact could be massive. Think about industries that have traditionally had these huge carbon footprints like manufacturing, transportation, energy. This AI could totally change how they operate, make them way more sustainable.
That's really interesting. It makes you wonder, though, are companies actually ready for that? It seems like it would take a real shift in thinking for a lot of them.
Oh, it's definitely a challenge, but there are a few things that could really push for wider adoption. For one, there's this growing awareness of how sustainability can actually save businesses money.
Mm.
You know, reducing waste, increasing energy efficiency that often translates to cost savings, and that's something every company cares about.
So it's not just about being environmentally conscious, it's about being smart with your business.
Exactly. And then there's also the whole regulatory landscape as governments around the world start implementing stricter environmental regulations, maybe even carbon taxes. Companies that are ahead of the curve on this will be in a much better position.
It sounds like AI could really be a game changer when it comes to climate change, but I'm sure there are still obstacles.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges in actually adopting this kind of technology?
One big one is data privacy. To get a truly accurate assessment, these AI systems need a lot of data about a company's operations, and that raises concerns about how that data is used, who has access to it, and how it's protected.
Yeah, data privacy is a huge deal,
Huh.
especially now with how much we've seen data being mishandled or even exploited.
Exactly. And then there's the cost factor. Implementing these systems can be expensive, which might be tough for smaller companies to swallow. And we also need skilled workers who know how to manage and understand all this data. So there's a workforce development element to consider as well.
It's definitely complicated with a lot of different factors at play. It feels like we're at this crossroads. AI has this incredible potential to help us with some of the world's biggest problems, but there are also these valid concerns that we can't just ignore.
And that's exactly why it's so important to be having these discussions. It's not about blindly accepting every new AI development, but about moving forward, carefully asking the tough questions and making sure we're using this technology ethically and responsibly.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a ton of ground today, from AI diagnosing diseases to these tech giants setting ethical guidelines to AI's potential in the fight against climate change. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has. And, if you're listening to this and feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information, just remember AI isn't some far off thing in the future. It's here, it's now, and it's already changing our world in these really big ways. So it's up to all of us to stay informed, ask those critical questions, and demand better from the people creating these powerful tools.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's our show for today, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of AI.